こんにちは、皆さん。私はエイミー・ウィボウと言います。Airbnb と働いています。Hello everyone, I'm Amy Wibowo and I work as a software engineer at Airbnb. And today I'm going to talk to you about knitting. Now, before you leave the room because you're worried that you're at the wrong conference, I promise you that this talk is also about hardware hacking, problem solving, and there will even be some Ruby code. You're just going to have to wait to see how. So all stories start with an inspiration, and this is mine. A couple years ago, a video game review website called Kotaku published an article on obscure Nintendo add-ons that never made the cut. You might have heard of some of the more obscure ones, including a baseball bat add-on for baseball video games, a golfing add-on for golfing video games, and a sneaker scope add-on for shooting video games. But you might not have known that Nintendo had plans to make a knitting add-on to their Super Nintendo. The interface would be like Mariopaint. You would be able to draw on the screen using controllers, but you would actually be able to do stuff with your drawings. After you drew patterns, you would be able to put them on sweaters, scarves, and socks and mittens, and things like that. The comments for the article said something like, "Lol, we can totally understand why this Nintendo add-on never made it. But I had a very different reaction when I read the article, and I was extremely sad. I was extremely sad that this didn't exist because I thought it was the best thing in the world, and I would have wanted to use it every day." So I did my research. I was curious if Nintendo had prototypes of this knitting machine, or if anyone else had made a home knitting machine that was available to buy. It turned out that a bunch of companies made knitting machines for home use in the 1980s, but they stopped production in the 90s mostly, and so it was kind of hard to find one. But it was still possible to find one on eBay or Craigslist, and as fate would have it, I found one an hour-and-a-half drive away from where I lived, and I went to pick it up. A lot of the parts were missing, and it was old, but it was something. It was the start of my dream. And to reiterate my dream again in cartoon form, it was to take pictures, to send them to a knitting machine, and to end up with sweaters with those pictures on them. So now that I had this machine, I could carry out my plan. Step one of the plan, learn how to operate the damn thing. Because just figuring out the basic functionality of the knitting machine was super daunting. It came with a very thick manual with lots of obscure knitting words that I didn't understand. There were 200 needles that moved in and out, and the ability to attach 2 different colors of yarn through the needles, and the 2 different colors of yarn was what would allow you to make patterns. And if this is what a knitting machine looks like, this is what using a knitting machine feels like. There were so many moving parts and buttons, and I was worried that if I pressed the wrong thing, this would happen. Or at least that one of the needles would break and I would have no idea how to fix it. Luckily, I had a team of people to help me on this project that was both fearless and inventive. This is the team of Airbnb engineers that helped me hack a knitting machine for last year's Airbnb hackathon. Airbnb hosts internal hackathons twice a year for the entire product team, both designers and engineers. So you end up with a lot of projects that you wouldn't normally see at hackathons because designers are allowed to participate. Not only allowed, encouraged. But wait, Airbnb hackathon, you ask, what does that have to do with traveling? I asked the hackathon organizer if this was a valid idea for something to work on at the Airbnb hackathon, despite it not having anything to do with traveling. But he reminded me that Airbnb was founded by 2 designers and that Airbnb believes in the intertwining of design and technology and that this was a good example of that. And so I should go ahead and do it. So many different kinds of engineers signed up to help me with this project. There was an iOS engineer, an SRE engineer, a performance engineer, a front-end engineer, and this is all just to say that we were a bunch of engineers that knew nothing about knitting. But my knitting machine teammates were some of the best teammates I ever had, and we worked really well together. I think it was partly because we didn't know anything about machine knitting that none of us had any ego involved. So it didn't matter whose solution we used to a problem. It was just important that we figured out how to make this work together. Going back to Jabba the Hutt, the reason that we had to be fearless was that the knitting machine was really daunting. It was a technology that none of us had used before, and it was from the 1980s. And the knitting machine was missing a bunch of parts. And that was also why we had to be inventive. We had to MacGyver some of the parts that we were missing. But the good part about being an engineer is that you can apply your problem-solving skills to anything, including knitting. This is an example of a problem that we needed to be resourceful and inventive to solve. We were encountering problems at every corner, even before we turned the machine on. Just preparing the yarn to use in the machine was difficult. If you've gone to a craft store, you'll know that yarn is usually sold in balls for hand knitters, but that's optimized for hand knitting and not for machines. So the best way to feed yarn into a knitting machine is to have it wrapped around as a spool, kind of like the way sewing machines are. And there was a contraption that came with our old knitting machine that let you do that, but a lot of the parts were broken or missing, so we had to come up with our own version of it, and we did this with coffee cups. Here's a picture or a video of my teammate Dave using the contraption that we made to spool yarn. So after we learned to set up and use the knitting machine to knit a solid row of solid colors, the next step was to use the knitting machine for patterns. So I mentioned before that the knitting machine could take up to 2 different colors of yarn, and it could alternate which color it was using at any point in time to knit patterns. In addition, the knitting machine had some patterns built in, which specified which yarn to feed for a number of stitches at a time. And even though this was something already built into the machine, it was twice as difficult because we were working with 2 different colors of yarn, and that meant twice the chance for it to get tangled, and it also meant reading an additional 50 pages in the manual. And just to show how difficult this step was, on the left is our first attempt to knit a pattern. We chose some wrong settings, we chose like the wrong thickness of yarn, and on the right is when we successfully attempted to knit polka dots later that same day. Another example of using engineering or science to solve knitting problems was when we had lots of problems with yarn getting caught in the machine. So we used many different types and thicknesses of yarn, and we wrote down which kinds worked and which kinds didn't until we finally narrowed down the best types of yarn to use. We got the best results with animal yarns like sheep or llama yarns, and we're thinking that it's because animal yarns come with natural oils that help keep them running through the machine smoothly. We also got the best results when we used a thicker yarn as the background yarn and a thinner yarn as the detail yarn. But after we figured out how to use the machine's built-in patterns, we weren't done yet. As far as we could tell, the intended user of this 1980s knitting machine was an old grandma, because all of the patterns that were built in were things like teddy bears and bows and roses. And I don't know about you, but I would rather have a picture of Grumpy Cat on my sweater than a teddy bear. So we still wanted to accomplish that. So step 3 was to send the knitting machine our own pictures or patterns. This goal would be split into several parts. So first, I should explain that the knitting machine, being from the 1980s, took additional patterns from a floppy drive. But if we could emulate a floppy drive on our computer, then we could trick the knitting machine into thinking that it was reading patterns from a floppy drive and send it whatever images we wanted. So we had to look up the the pinout of the knitting machine serial cable because it was non-standard, and then we had to make our own wire to fit that pinout, our own cable to fit that pinout. So we had a cable that was USB that went to the knitting machine serial port. And then we found a script that emulated a floppy drive on our computer. So the next two steps, we wanted to convert any image into a low-res 1-bit bitmap, which was the image format that the knitting machine understood. And we wanted to do this with an algorithm that would dither so that areas that were like medium darkness wouldn't just be converted to either black or white. So we also found a script for converting images to black and white 1-bit bitmaps. And this was the final piece. So we can now have our knitting machine read from a computer as if it were a floppy drive. So here's one of our first custom patterns. Note the dithering on the Shiba Inu. If it's hard to read, it says, wow, oh my god, such fair isle. Fair isle is a kind of knitting stitch. And here's Grumpy Cat. So this day of the hackathon, this was the third day of the hackathon. The first day had been devoted to just learning how to use the machine. The second day had been used to figure out how to send patterns to the machine. And so the third day, we were just having a lot of fun and uploading lots and lots of images and having a great time. But then we realized that we didn't want to limit sending pictures to the knitting machine to just us. We knew how to do it by command line, like running the scripts and then turning on the serial port connection and going over to the knitting machine and pressing the right buttons. But we wanted to make sure that everyone at the company, if they wanted to, could send their own images to the knitting machine. We wanted anyone to be able to print memes from yarn. So for that goal, we wanted to make knitting machine accessible on the web. And it would be a super simple interface. You would choose a photo to upload. You would upload it, and then you would send the image to the machine with a button that said knit. And then the screen would give you instructions for what buttons on the machine you should press to knit your design. So here's a video of the whole sequence in action. Oh, is there an output? Oh, thank you. So I brought some knitting samples if you want to come find me afterwards to look at them. This is a Ruby, and this is a Grumpy Cat, and there's also one with Miffy. So in case it wasn't very clear earlier, on the left is the input image we sent to the machine, and on the right was the knitted output. So now it is time to show you some code. It's pretty simple. It's Ruby and Sinatra. And this is the server-side controller code. So first, it saves the image. Then it converts the image to a 1-bit bitmap, and then it initiates a serial port connection with the knitting machine and sends the machine the pattern. And this is the view side code. It just has a form where you upload the image. So things that we learned from this adventure. One thing that I was surprised by was that almost all of my teammates who worked on performance and scaling and like lots of difficult engineering issues at Airbnb said that knitting was one of the hardest things that they had ever worked on. And so one of the things that happened was we gained a huge respect for grandmothers and anyone else who knits, because that shit is hard. And another learning was that teams work really well when they operate on zero ego, since none of us were invested in the knitting machine, in proving that we were better at either of any of our teammates at machine knitting. We only focused on the result, which was wanting to make the knitting machine work as well as possible. And lastly, it's really enjoyable to apply programming to any of your hobbies, no matter how unrelated they seem, especially hobbies related to creating. And I challenge you to find a hobby that is more unrelated to Ruby than knitting and apply your programming skills to it. Oh, and also that it's really great to take up something completely new that you know nothing about, because it's humbling and challenging and refreshing, and it reminds you what it's like to be a beginner, which is really important when you're working with new programmers. And there are a lot of things that we'd love to do to take this further. On the programming axis, or on the hardware hacking axis, it would be really great to automate more parts of the machine. You saw that a person had to move parts of the machine back and forth, and it would be great to have that automated. On the web interface axis, it would be great to be able to just draw onto a canvas what you want your sweater to look like and have the knitting machine print that out. Or on the knitting axis, it would be amazing to learn how to use the machine better to make full garments like sweaters and socks and mittens. There are books about that, but they were very intimidating, so that's like a next level project. And lastly, I would love to talk to you about ideas if you love to make things, if you love to craft, and you want to combine that with computing. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much. We have 10 minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions?
Did you produce any wearable garments from this, like a full sweater then, or?
No, so we focused on just getting images onto swatches. But the amazing thing about conferences is, one of the previous conferences that I attended, someone came up to me afterwards to tell me that there's a school of machine knitting in Seattle where they teach people how to make sweaters like over a weekend. So I'm totally going to go to that and have a bunch of sweaters now.
Awesome, you should. This was fantastic. Thanks.
Thank you.
Was the manual process that you had to go back and forth because of that's the way Nintendo made it, or was it because there were parts missing from the machine? I'm curious what they thought the interaction would be when they designed it.
I think most standard home knitting machines, you have to move the arm back and forth yourself. Okay. And most industrial machines, that's like automatic. So okay. I'm guessing that Nintendo's would have been back and forth also. I know that some people have been working on attaching that to like parts of a printer so that it will move itself back and forth. So that would be pretty awesome
That would
to
be
get
really
to
cool.
do that.
Thank you.
Are there more questions? Okay, thank you very much. I mean,
Thank you.